episode 170 of the Power Score LSAT podcast. This is Jon in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
Yes, he is. How you doing up there, buddy?
I'm outstanding. And yourself? How is LA these days?
Hanging
Seeing
in.
the news a lot.
Riotous, it sounds like. I hear things. But fortunately they're far away from me. So my mom texted me this morning. She goes, "You're not in gunfire or anything, are you?" I was like, "Jesus, Mom, no."
And I think you said that to me, and then I said, I don't think people really understand how big Los Angeles is.
Yeah.
It's a big place.
Yeah, no, I'm quite far away. The closest danger I've been in recently were the fires that were still 2 miles away from me. And that was a little bit hairy. Whatever's going on right now, which I honestly don't know, far, far away.
Well, there you go then. Glad you're safe.
Thanks, buddy. Yeah, the biggest risk to me at the moment is just sleeplessness, because we have just emerged on the other side of a very long June LSAT week, which we're about to discuss.
Yeah, you in particular spent a lot of time with it.
Oh, yes, I did. I'm feeling every minute of it, which is why I think we can get into the main topic, which is, what are you drinking?
Well, you and I are drinking very different drinks as usual.
Yeah, usually, yeah.
To me, it's summertime, pool's open, people having fun. So I went with a more summery, lighter, fruitier drink as usual. In fact, I would have one of these if it was December, but it's much better in June. The classic Singapore Sling.
Nice. If you asked me to make a Singapore Sling with a gun to my head, you'd just have to pull the trigger. I couldn't tell you.
There's gin in it, which is not usually my favorite thing, but you cut it with a bunch of fruit juices. All I know about this was invented in the Raffles Hotel in Singapore, and that's why it's called Singapore Sling. And,
Nice.
like 70 years ago.
Well, I like that you're having a sunshiny kind of day. I, on the other hand, have got the shades drawn and I'm drinking an Irish coffee, which is just a very, very strong coffee with a bunch of Jameson poured into it. So that's where I'm at.
These two summarize our lives very well.
I'd say so. Our personality.
You made the song choice, though, although I am familiar with it, surprisingly.
Yeah. You're familiar with it, I think, because you and I have both actually had the pleasure of seeing this guy perform live. This was Bottle Rock. God, what year was that? 2019?
It was probably, I think, 2018, more likely.
18, maybe? I was still with that girl, so it had to be pre-2020. Anyway.
That girl.
Yeah, it's an artist, goes by the name Shaky Graves, and he just has a song that I like called Dearly Departed. Again, reference to nothing. If anyone's thinking like, oh no, there's going to be some sort of like, graveyard thing. No, it's just, I just like this song. And Shaky Graves is cool.
So, yeah, they were on a side stage at Bottle Rock,
and
you and I and
that girl.
Other people ended up walking by and listening and thinking, that's pretty good stuff.
I think I probably drug you over there, and then his guitar broke and he ended up playing a different backup guitar for the thing. But yeah, he's really, really talented. I like this song a lot. So if you're in the mood for some new music, here you go. If you know Shaky Graves, congratulations. He's a talent.
So by the way, that Bottle Rock was one of the best ever. The lineup on that one was amazing.
I mean, Muse played that year. We saw Halsey play. Bruno Mars played.
Struts played.
The Struts. We saw the Struts play twice, I think. Twice, yeah. Yeah,
they did a main stage show, and then a couple hours later, they actually hit the acoustic stage.
Yeah, that was the year. So I'm really glad we got a chance to do that. Of course, you had VIP tickets, and I did not. So
sorry. Also, that's the way our life goes.
Story of my life.
Yeah.
Let's change the subject before I get too mad.
I did go to Bottle Rock last week or a week and a half ago. Saw Green Day, and they were great.
Yeah, remember when I said change the subject? When you stayed on the
let's
subject?
Keep talking about it.
Was Green Day good?
They are always excellent. My kid is the biggest Green Day fan in, the tri-state area.
You've seen them like 4 times this year.
I have seen them several times recently, and I will see them again in July in Minneapolis.
Oh, man. All right. Well, twist the knife, brother. Twist the knife.
Sorry, bud.
It's okay. It's okay. Let's talk about the LSAT world, shall we? Or
Yes.
do you want to keep? Do you have another
You want to
knife?
keep talking music? Because I could talk about that
I
all
know.
night. That would actually make me happy. Talking about the next, 5 test dates, not.
I know. So let's get through this quickly then, because me neither. Let's talk though about what is coming up and what's going on right now. Obviously, this episode we're going to cover the June test. It is over, happily, at least the main test days. There is a makeup test that's coming next Tuesday. So if you had any issues, technical or otherwise, you will have a chance to take the June test again. It'll be different. It'll be new content. You'll have to start over. You will get your score the same time as everyone else, which will be Wednesday, June 25th. It'll come out bright and early, 9 a.m. Eastern that morning. And then the remaining 4 tests of the year, August, September, October, November. So just a hot and frenzied run. I'm going to go through this really quickly. So again, be patient. The registration deadline for August is still open. You can do this up until the day after June test scores release. So the registration deadline for August is June 26th. Those test dates are Wednesday through Saturday, August 6th through the 9th. Those scores come out August 27th. September, the registration deadline is July 22nd. Those test dates, again, on Wednesday through Saturday, August 3rd through the 6th. Those scores come out on September 24th. There's too many numbers and dates. October, this is a bit of a weird one. The registration deadline there is August 21st. Those test dates skip a day in the middle. So it's October 3rd and 4th, skip the 5th, October 6th and 7th. Those scores come out October 24th. And then finally, November, which is the last test of this calendar year. The registration deadline there is September 25th. The test dates there are November 5th through the 8th, and those scores will come out November 26th. I think I got all that right. Please be gracious if I didn't.
Check the lsac.org website.
Thank you. I should have started and finished with that. I don't know.
You just save you all that time. The thing I'll note is that the June LSAT scores are released on the 25th. Mm-hmm. The registration deadline for August, all right, a couple months from now, is actually the 26th. So if you took June, you get your scores back. You have essentially a day to decide.
Days. Yeah, really 2.
Day and a half.
Yeah.
To decide before you would take August. The August scores are released. You'll have well missed the September registration date. You're actually 6 days after October. I imagine that if you sign up for August and you want to sign up for October, they'll have some kind of deal where you can register and then they'll refund you, which they've done. So that's one thing. But if you take September, you will then get the scores from September the day before the registration deadline for November. Mm-hmm. So sometimes they cut you a break, sometimes they don't. I continue to laugh about the convoluted scheduling of all this. It's like, there's no administrative reasoning that you can tell me that you can't release the scores fast enough before the next registration deadline. All right, if it's the next month, I get it. But 2 months away, don't tell me anything. I'm not listening to any excuses about this because seriously, in a digital age, you're going to claim to me, I need 8 weeks to do this? No, you don't.
Yeah. Obviously, you and I agree on this. We've continued to complain. They have adjusted these things, I think, largely because of our complaints. Maybe not largely, but at least in part because of our complaints.
Yeah, they try. I mean, as you can see, when you have the August test date release coming on August 27th and the registration for October is August 21st, there's going to be a problem. You know that they're going to get pressure and they'll do something about it. So why not do something about it ahead of time? Yeah. It seems like we're always doing this thing. Oh, hey, wait, you can sign up and then get a refund. I'm like, you've done that multiple times. And if that's the way it's going to be, why not just push the test score release up a day or two? I realize I always want to have it on Wednesdays now. Or push back October by a week, which would be just fine here.
They just moved the refund day for June to accommodate this for people from April. They just did this, so we know this.
That's exactly right. And of course, if you're taking any one of these tests and you want some free assistance or just to see what it is that PowerScore can do, there are a variety of free webinars that are coming up. The easiest way to get there to sign up for any of these is just go to powerscore.com/free seminars, and then it'll redirect you to wherever the actual page is these days, which is a URL so long that we don't have time for it in this podcast. But there are actually 4 webinars coming up. There's one that is actually going to be tonight, the day this is released.
Right.
So June 11th, that is basic conditional reasoning. Then in just less than 2 weeks, on the 24th, there's advanced conditional reasoning. And then on July 8th, there is reading comprehension, a discussion of comparative reading passages. And then finally on July 23rd, we go back to LR to talk about parallel reasoning. So any one of those are all free. Go over some LSAT questions, take a look at some concepts, and just basically give out a free lesson.
Yeah. Come learn some stuff for free and get a taste of really how our courses in general tend to operate. Let's talk about the June test, because that is why we are here. And Dave, if you don't mind, I'm going to put a little bit of the onus on this, just kind of back on you. Tell us a little bit about just some of the numbers. This was a big test.
Yes. I was going to say something flip, but I'm not going to.
I don't know what that even would have been. I would imagine it was childish and sexual.
No.
Oh.
It was childish, probably.
Okay.
In any event, if you take a look at this test was, about 23,900 test takers when all was said and done. If you schedule it out over Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, the Wednesday was the smallest day. It was 5,300. Give or take some. Then Thursday was just a shade larger at 5,400. Then Friday was 5,800. And this time, this isn't always the case, but it was this time, the Saturday was the largest of all the days, jumped up to 7,400. Add that all together and you get just under 24,000 people, which is indeed a fairly sizable exam.
Yeah, that's big.
One point of note, though, we've seen this, it's been rising over the last, year or two, especially as the remote test takers had some problems a couple years ago. 57% of test takers were in-person test takers this time around. So obviously that means that 43% were remote/online test takers. So now you got more people in person. When this started out, if I'm not mistaken, it was more people remote.
Yeah.
There were a few server issues and remote issues with proctors, and it has slowly changed over. And the last couple of tests, I know it's been more in person.
Yeah, the reputation, maybe, I don't know if that's the best word for it, seems to have kind of pushed people to go and do this thing in person. I get it. You and I have actually had this debate a little bit where I would certainly still want to take it remotely myself, just because I don't want to put on shoes if I can help it. But I think you would probably be an in-person test taker.
No,
You'd still take it at home, you think?
Yeah, because I'm lazy and I also live in the middle of nowhere. I mean,
true.
I'm an hour from San Francisco, so I'm not in the middle of nowhere. But at the same time, I'm going to be driving at least 30 minutes or more to get to some test center. And of course, I don't like dealing with other people's noise, even though they give you kind of like, sound blocking devices and so forth. There's always something about other people in a testing room that can be a problem. Somebody's coughing, somebody's leg shaking, somebody's tapping their pencil over there while they take some other exam. So I would prefer the experience of remote with the reliability of in-person. So if you can get that for me, John, we'll do that.
There you go. Well, as my mom's made very clear to me, I'd have to gunfight my way down to a in-person test center these days. So I need to stay home.
I don't know if it's that bad. In any event, there is one more test day that is coming up, and that is on Tuesday, the 17th. That is the makeup test. So anybody who had problems this time around, and just to address that, there was nothing major that happened, nothing systemic. In talking to LSAC on a couple of the days during the exam, they reported that, there were no big issues that they saw. The wait and call times on their chat and their telephone lines were minimal. People were able to get through pretty quickly. That's a good thing. Obviously, people still had issues because there's always something. There's always some proctor somewhere who does something or takes control or leaves their mic on or somebody gets ghosted either once they're trying to
internet
sign in.
Kicks out or power goes.
Yeah, they get ghosted at halftime when they take a break after section 2. There's all these little issues that pop up, and I realize that is bad news, but it is honestly, for at least the massive test takers, far worse when there's some kind of server issue, test system issue. We haven't seen one of those in a while now, and you would hope that you wouldn't. We had some of those very early on when they moved over to Prometric, and we haven't had those after the first couple of months for a while now.
Yeah, I didn't see anything this time either, which is obviously good news. Sucks if you have an individual issue, but at least there was nothing, like you say, systemic.
Yeah, the
So,
one good thing is if you go sit down and take that test on the 17th, you will still get your score a mere 8 days later.
Mhm.
Once again, proving that if they
I know
wanted
what
to
you're gonna
produce
say.
scores within 8 days, you certainly could do so. That's all I have to say about that.
It's not all you have to say about that. It's just all you're going to at the moment.
I've complained about it in
Yeah.
other times. I get the issues.
I mean, yeah, we both do. But that is obviously, it's nice to have the safety net of a retake. So next Tuesday, if you had any issues, you can do it. You go right into your LSAC account. There is a place there where you can request the makeup test if you had some sort of issue, and you'll get approved. Just if you don't get approved right away, be politely persistent. That's the advice that I would give you, and you should
That's
get
good
through.
advice for life, quite honestly.
Usually.
Mostly.
Speaking of advice, good advice for life, let's talk a little bit about the test and what it is that I think we're going to cover for the rest of this episode. And Dave, you usually lead us into this with some disclaimers. Do you want to?
Sure. I'll totally do it.
Look how thrilled you are.
Done it 100 times.
I know.
What's one more?
What's one more?
So, obviously, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about test content and talk a little bit about what was scored sections, talk a little bit about, especially in the case of RC, what was unscored or experimental sections. And then we're going to talk a little bit about difficulty and even make a prediction about the overall scaling if you were to go out and try to score 170. How many questions could you miss? And one of the things that always comes up is, this is a pretty nuanced conversation at times. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's very blunt. But at the same time, there's a lot of nuance. And so the first thing that we always ask is that please don't summarize this online. I've seen it repeatedly, and oftentimes the very nuanced points that I'm trying to highlight the most, the ones that are, I think, the most important to people are the very first things that get missed. As somebody just says, oh, it was this. They just go to the very end of the podcast and say, that's what it was. We really prefer that people hear what we have to say directly because we can temper some of the comments, especially if we say a section was easier or harder. Sometimes that irritates people. And, we try to explain a little bit around that as to why we might have that particular belief. Another thing I'll point out is that as we talk about this information, a lot of times people get focused on section order. They are like, well, no, I was RC and then 3 LRs. That doesn't mean anything to us. That just means that you had 1 scored RC and 2 scored LR, just like everybody, and then you had 1 experimental LR. You could have someone else who had 3 LRs and then an RC, and they could have had the exact same content as you. Or alternatively, someone else could have been a single RC, 3 LRs in a row after that. They could have entirely different content than you. The section order does not matter. I think it matters internally to each test taker when they're taking the exam. Like, I'd rather start off with LR, if we're being honest.
Same.
I don't need to start off an LSAT with RC. That just doesn't seem like a fast, fun start for me. I'd rather get right into it and start really thinking heavily and jumping from argument to argument. So I think it matters to individuals, but it does not matter in terms of what is scored and what is not scored. Obviously, we're talking about test information that is from an exam that just occurred. And so we are basically allowed to talk about it in general kind of like terms. We'll talk about topics, we'll talk about some difficulty, but we won't talk about specific answers. LSAC does not want you to post specific solutions or answers. And the conversations they allow people to have, they don't allow them to have it until really Saturday night once it's over. And then people who are taking the retake won't get the same exam. So they allow people to have a brief, light conversation would be the best way of putting it after the main testing days are over. But one of the things I'll point out is as we go through this and we talk about all the sections, we can only predict what we know for sure was used. If we're not sure that something was used on the test, we usually won't recap it. Like if I think this section was used, I'm kind of hearing something that suggests it, we don't take a leap of faith. We wait until it is actually confirmed. And that means if we haven't heard from people, and that might be you, if we haven't heard from you about your test experience or given a breakdown of what you had on the exam, we can't make predictions. So that's especially true for you international test takers at times, because there's far fewer of you compared to the domestic exam that is actually out there. We're also, as I said, going to talk a little bit about difficulty, and I will remind everybody, almost paternally, that, hey, the real thing feels worse than practice. I don't know how many times you see people walk out of the test and the first thing they post on Reddit or Twitter or wherever, some forum, is, that was the hardest LSAT I've ever taken. And it probably was. It probably felt that way in the moment. A lot of times afterwards, people look at these exams, especially when they used to be released. They'd say, this was the hardest LSAT ever. And then they'd go back and look at the release version of it and be like, oh, it wasn't so tough. I just was under pressure. And so just keep that in mind. If you've walked out feeling badly, that's actually the normal thing. Almost everybody walks out feeling not fantastic about it. And, prep tests, practice tests, they're not real in the sense of it doesn't count. It's not on your permanent record. And because of that, there's a negativity bias that creeps in almost everybody's recollections. So when we start talking about some of this, if we say this was on the easier side, don't take offense. Don't shoot the messenger. We're just telling you what we are seeing from a lot of the information that we use. So, and that's true in terms of the relativity of difficulty. Everything that we talk about is hard. It's the LSAT. None of it is easy. So when I say something's easier or harder, it's already hard. It's just a matter of relatively harder or relatively easy, but all within that difficult scaling. I'll also point out, especially in past tests, we saw this quite a bit, test makers attempting to confuse you. Just because you have a passage that is about Nigeria and then you hear someone else talking about a passage about Nigeria, make sure that it's the same kind of discussion that's being had, because they are known to do this. They claim they don't do it on purpose, but I always laugh when I hear that, because I'm like, sure you don't. Sure you don't. Like, you're really going to tell me the tricks when I can see them with my own eyes. So this is why general conversation sometimes is a little bit dangerous, because you might think, all right, we both are talking about the same RC section because we had a passage about Nigeria. But as it happened in the past, when that occurred, there were actually two passages that were about Nigeria, one in one section, one in another section. So just keep that in mind as we kind of go through this, just to make sure that you confirm for yourself that, hey, this is the section that I think it was. This is the section that I had. This is why we always tell people, especially in the crystal ball, take detailed notes after your exam so that you can tie it back to what is real and what is scored, so that you know exactly which sections are going to count for your LSAT score and which one will not count. And speaking of experimentals, just keep in mind that our estimations of what's real and experimental are based on at least the assumption that when sections are reused, if they were previously scored, they will be scored again. So far, we haven't been wrong in figuring out what's real or experimental, but just keep in mind that when it comes to scoring, that is built into this. And I think it's a good assumption. There's no reason for something that was scored previously that we can prove. Maybe somebody had just one RC section and now it's being used again. Why would you put it into the experimental category? You already have all the information you need. Experimentals are designed to collect information about the section. They don't need any more information about it. It's already being scored. So I think it's a good assumption for us to make. Also, if you don't hear us talk about your section, whether it's experimental or otherwise, just keep in mind that sometimes it's confusing after the test. If you didn't take good notes, it all blurs together, especially after a day or two. We might not have heard from you. It's certainly possible. There is not free-flowing discussion online, so there's some discussion that is out there. There's certainly people who send us reports and what have you, but it is sometimes possible that you might not hear your section. If you don't, send us a message afterwards. Be like, hey, I had this section. I don't know if this ties to anything or if I'm just, not connecting it, but I did have this for sure. We'll add it to our database, and that database is what we use every single time going forward to figure out what is real and what is experimental, and to also assess difficulty. That database is pretty large, so we can certainly cross-reference a lot of information, and in some sections that we talk about, I could tell you every single question from 1 to 26 of the LR, exactly what the topic was, what type of question it was, but sometimes not. So if we haven't heard a certain question, it might not cross-reference with the archive that we're looking at. In any event, all that is to summarize and say, after this, please don't summarize it online. Just refer people to the podcast directly. And that, John, is a long series of disclaimers.
And that, Dave, is me very hydrated. Thank you. That gave me a chance to really get to the bottom of this coffee cup.
Enjoy it.
Thanks, buddy. I did. Let's start with the international test. And as we usually do with these things, let's do a quick self-assessment with our crystal balls, how we kind of did hits and misses and whatnot. What we do with international tests, quite frankly, is nothing. We really don't attempt to predict international tests because when it comes to these things and LSAC, really anything goes. They have been known to use old exams that they've used 4, 5, 6 times before. There's no predicting that sort of stuff. And what we saw with the international tests with this particular administration was exactly that. We saw a test that we had actually seen in use at least 4 times. I'd probably wager 6 before. We'll talk about the details and the content of that in just a second, but that puts us in a bit of a bind. What we also saw with the internationals, from what I could tell, was experimental LRs, which makes it doubly difficult in terms of prediction, in terms of estimation, because RCs are very easy for us to identify. LRs, there's just so much more content. It's hard to really nail down. And then finally, the last thing I'll say before I get into the actual content that we're going to discuss is that there was, as we're going to discuss here in just a bit, another RC in use. And we're going to cover this in the domestic test discussion because there was some overlap between international tests and domestic tests. They don't always do this. They did it this time. They did it back in April as well, where they used some content internationally, overseas, and domestically in the States and Canada that was the same. And when they do that, we just save that content for the domestic discussion that we're going to have in just a minute. So just know that if you don't hear what you had internationally, it's probably going to come up in just a minute. If you still don't hear what you had internationally, well, that's your fault because it means we didn't hear from you. And that's too bad. We would have liked to. Let's start with reading comp.
Yeah. And let me say this about the crystal ball and internationals.
Mm-hmm.
I think, we get that question a lot. We don't try to predict international tests just because it is such a small testing group comparatively, and the candidates they can use are highly variable. That doesn't mean that occasionally it doesn't overlap, which is funny because it's just like, that's just incidental. That is not something that we plan. We know that it happens. And so we always tell international, it might show up, but it's not showing up because of some grand scheme that we can see. We're attempting to look at a pattern in the crystal balls that we think, well, I think now has been proven, to come up over and over and over again. We're able to predict what is going to show up, but it's a very specific pattern that appears on the domestic tests. Occasionally, the international test will overlap with that, but it's not as reliable from a prediction standpoint, and that is why we don't try to predict international tests. If you're an international test taker in the future, you could say, well, I can look at this, and if I do see it, that's just a bonus for me, but it's no guarantee, and it's nothing that we're trying to predict, so we're not standing behind that as some kind of reliability thing for international tests.
Yeah.
So just be aware that's just how it works.
And well said. And I've posted this online repeatedly for international people because I get asked about it all the time, where they're like, well, what do I expect? And I'm like, well, don't.
A wider variety.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. What I think international people can take away from the crystal balls so that they don't actually just come off as useless or inapplicable is the topical predictions are probably not going to hit because, again, those are very specific to test reuses, but the conceptual predictions will. And the things that we predict in terms of like LR sections, where we're like, go do this section, or the reading comp passages, those are very, very useful to still do. And we hear from international people constantly where they're like, I'm glad I read this passage, or I'm glad I did this section. So those still, I think, hold up.
I would agree with you on that. So, John, if you don't mind, I'll just take the international test.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, which this is good for me because then I leave you with the domestic test.
God, is that how this is? Okay, that's how this is.
But I had to do the disclaimers, so this is all balancing itself out.
Fair. Go for it.
Now, the first thing is that John talked about 2 scored RCs that were in use. One of them featured the discussion about Vera Brittain. We will cover that passage under the domestic exam. So I'm just going to mention that every other international test taker that we talked to had the following RC section, which has been used many, many times. We consider it to basically be the February 2018 exam, but it was used again in June 21, October 22 for international, September 2023, and so on. This was 27 questions. We know this one very well overall. It is definitely on the harder side of things.
Yeah.
The first topic is about Elaine Locke and the Harlem Renaissance leaders in African-American adult education. The second passage is a science one about beetle larvae protected from ants by cottonwood trees and the nature of the wood there. And then Cicella Bock's theory on lying democracy is the third one. And then the last one, unsurprisingly, a legally related passage, arguments for and against lengthening copyright laws on the books, talking about Parliament, and that was also the comparative passage. So that was your scored RC for many of you on the international side. If you are an international test taker and you're like, that wasn't my RC, it was probably the Vera Brittain one, we'll come back to that one later. We're not going to cover it twice.
Yeah.
Let's go through the 3 different scored LRs that we saw. And as usual, we will not talk about experimental LR because we found that doing that in the past actually made it more confusing. Just so much LR to talk about. People were like, was that my scored or not? So these were the real sections. The first one off that same February 18 exam that the Elaine Locke RC comes from. It's a pretty reasonable section. You've got drug testing and bike racing in Europe, clearly something that's really needed. Lance Armstrong. Ethical furniture restoration. That's always funny to me anytime you talk about restoration, because both John and I lived in Charleston, where restoration is a big deal, since it's one of the older cities in this country. Then vitamin B6 in elderly populations. Shoes made by the XZ company or XYZ company and ankle injuries, and then foreshocks and earthquakes. And since John and I both live in California, we have some familiarity with foreshocks, earthquakes, and aftershocks.
Yeah, that section had a whole lot of topicality start to finish for us.
It sure
coast
did.
to coast, Dave.
I mean, at some point they will release that section. I don't know whether it's next year or 5 years from now. They only release one test a year, and it's weird these days. They really slowed it down, but I'll be interested in seeing that because we've seen so many test takers encounter this now. Tens of thousands of people have taken that particular section.
Well, and the February tests have been the ones that have started to creep out. February 15 just came out. Like they're coming.
All right.
So there you go.
And this was a predicted test also. So this was one of the LRs that we had expected to be used in general. So seeing it, this was a good example of how you get overlap between international test takers and the domestic level predictions that we make.
Yeah.
All right,
I think we told people to be on the lookout for the June 21, like our podcast from June 21, which is a February 18 reuse. And here it was. So yeah.
That's exactly right. And I think we talked about June 21 LR specifically in there. So
you did. I remember you doing this in the crystal ball.
Yes.
Yeah.
I consider both of us to be involved in the crystal ball. So us. All right, let's go to the next scored LR section. This was from January 2021, I think reused in October 2024. And I know, John, when you figured out that it had been used in October 24, you were surprised by this.
Hey, this is a quick turnaround on this, if you think about it. I mean, what are we, 10 months out? 8?
Yeah.
Something like that? I don't know. I can't do math, but it was quick.
You can see that the only reason that they would be doing this is because they went from a domestic usage, I believe, to an international usage.
I don't think they would have done this domestically this fast.
No, they wouldn't. And, this is the kind of thing that we watch closely. Like, what is the timeline between the last use and the next use? Usually it's going to be a year at the least. So the use here surprised us. But remember that what LSAC does is they take all the people who took it the last time and then they say, well, who's taking it at this upcoming time? And if you've seen it before, they cut you out. They give you a different exam. If you haven't, they can go ahead and use it and feel like, well, it's new to you. And that's a fair thing. Well, with the international test population being so much smaller, it allows them to actually say, all right, maybe a lot of people took it in October of 2024, but not many of you people are now international test takers. So just kind of an interesting, footnote to how all of this works behind the scenes. This section featured domesticated elephants, whether a professor committed self-plagiarism, a concept that I've often thought about because, you talk about the LSAT all the time, you're going to repeat yourself. Can I plagiarize myself? I don't think so. But this is more like if you publish a book, maybe later on, you might have plagiarized part of that, perhaps accidentally.
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle and children talking about honesty. Then animals licking salt and potassium in plants. Is a tomato a fruit or a vegetable? The age-old question. And
Fruit.
it's a fruit, if I recall.
Yeah, it's fruit.
Yep. And then Nile crocodiles swimming to South America.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like a Pangaea discussion.
Pronounce it Pangaea?
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to let you.
It's Pangea.
I'm going to let you have that one.
Pangaea.
I'm going to let it go.
Is it GIF or GIF?
Is it a fruit? I'm going to let it go.
Is it GIF or GIF? You tell me then.
GIF.
It's GIF, so it's Pangaea.
Oh, my God.
Get out of here.
Okay.
All right. And then another exam usage that we predicted was the reuse of the April 21 test. And that actually features the section here that's third.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple of questions from that. This was also a real scored LR section for international test takers. Are Mars meteors, made of iron or nickel? Cackling geese building nests in Canada. A lot of people, especially up north, not big geese fans. Not me. I love geese, man.
Scary, man.
They're awesome. They fly over my house all the time. And they're loud as hell, but they're very cool. And they're angry birds.
Vicious birds. Dinosaurs. I hate them.
They don't fool around. When I lived in Minnesota, we'd run into flocks of them. And they are like, especially if they had young out there, they're like, get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
But I like that, a little feistiness.
They are feisty.
Exposure to art makes the one value art less. That seems ridiculous to me. Emission standards. And then finally, frowning and face muscles. And that just reminds me of that old adage. It's like it only takes like 20 muscles to smile and 40 muscles to frown. It's more work to frown. Okay, thanks, Mom. Appreciate the advice.
That's probably why we both look so old. But
I don't know. I think that's universal. I probably said it to my kid. Actually, I can guarantee I never have.
She's a pretty smiley kid, so I'm not sure.
Not really.
No?
You haven't seen
her in a minute.
while. Yeah.
Maybe she's only smiley when I'm around, Dave.
They have. Well, I mean,
debatable.
Anybody in that age range is automatically, angry at the world and their parents. So
that's fair.
They're pretty cool, though.
Anyway.
That's why we see Green Day all the time.
There you go. So those are the three real LR sections that we saw internationally. I would wager that's overkill. I don't know why they needed three. I also would possibly wager that that's not the only three that were used, and that's just the only three that we heard about. I hate that, but
Well, this is the kind of thing. Look, if they had a section that they gave to 10 people,
right,
it's invisible to us for the most part. And also that usage is such a footnote that it doesn't even really count because it didn't happen for enough people. So it wouldn't affect our predictions going forward in terms of whether or not this had been used.
Yeah. But notice what it is. Everything that we saw internationally is a reuse. There was nothing new. Everything there was used for minimum the second or third time. And some of it, like that reading comp, was used for like the fifth or sixth time.
Yeah, to be honest with you, that actually follows a pattern that has existed for many, many years.
Right.
International and Sabbath tests, when they used to have them, the LSAT was always given on Saturday, and so there was often a Sabbath test that allowed people who had problems testing on Saturday to get out of testing on Saturday and take it a different day. They, in the past, often used tests from before because they're such small groups. And if you think about it, do you really want to take an entirely new test that you want to get a lot of data on and give it to a really small test group? No.
Yeah,
so usually they would not flip that into international Sabbath test takers. Now the Sabbath testing is essentially done as a kind of thing they have to get around because each of these LSATs has 3 or 4 days. Right. In any event, let's go to the scaling of what we want to look at here. And in our case, we will start off and talk about the way we look at the scoring matrix. And I'll say it now, and then I'll probably repeat it again when we get to the domestic part. But the idea about talking about difficulty within the section is, all right, how difficult is it overall at the 170 level? It's very easy for us to see difficulty at the highest ranges. It's much more difficult for us to see it in the middle ranges. So when we talk about this, what we look at is we say, well, how many questions can you miss for a 170 as a baseline? And we start out that you could miss 7 questions. And then we look at each section, and then usually what happens is either we say, hey, that section is normal, kind of like middle of the road, and it won't have an effect on the scaling. You'd stay at missing 7 questions to get 170. And then usually what happens is a section might be harder than average, and we can see that it would add to the difficulty at the top range, and then that would move the scale and loosen it by 1. So you'd go from 7 to 8. There have been very rare occasions where the scale got tightened. Really, if the new format of the test, that doesn't really happen. Just because you have fewer questions than we used to have. We used to be dealing with 100-question LSATs where section impacts were a little bit different than they are now. So usually when we talk about this, you'll either see no effect or you'll see it moves it by 1. But the idea is, well, how many questions can you miss to get a 170? We start off at -7. If you had that RC, that was the lock, the beetle larvae, the Cicelabach, and the book copyrights. This was a harder than average RC section, although these days almost all RC is, the average is hard. This would have moved your scale by 1. So you would have gone from 7 to 8. And by the way, if you have the other RC, you'll find later on, I believe, that it does not move the scale. So you would have stayed at 7, but we'll come back to that when we talk about the Vera Brittain passage next.
Vera Brittain, yeah.
The 3 LRs all have no impact on this. Each one of them is fairly reasonable in the middle as far as LR goes. And so the vast majority, if you had this lineup with this lock RC, you are a -8. You could miss 8 questions. If you had the Vera Brittain, it looks like you could miss 7 questions. And 7, 8, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 are all possible scalings that you have for 170, given the information that LSAC has put out there. A lot of them are 8 or 9. So having a bunch of them here that are 8, pretty normal.
Yeah. Yeah, I know this probably bums some people out because they want something looser, but 8 is standard. 8 is pretty normal. I think that's what you're going to get. If you had the Vera Brittain stuff and you're a -7, which, spoiler, that's what you're going to be, that's pretty normal too. 7 and 8 are about middle of the road when it comes
7,
to
8,
skills.
9.
Yeah, 9 too. I don't think there's too many international tests that could have gotten to a 9, and I don't see how these LRs would have moved it there. That's my take.
And I agree with you. All right, John.
All right.
First time today.
I think we were due then. Well,
It's
here
your
we
time
go.
to shine now.
It is my time to talk now. We'll see about the shine part. I am certainly going to talk for quite a minute. Dave, drink. The rest of you, buckle up, because here we go. I am going to talk to you about the domestic June 2025 LSAT, and I'm going to start with where we began with the last thing, which is I'm going to start with a self-assessment of the crystal ball, which is really just to say, how did we do with our predictions about the domestic test? And here I can say we nailed it. There was quite a lot of content in use this past week, most of which was reused. And we got, I think, all of the reuses save one, which I'll touch on, exactly right. Which, Dave, I think this makes us, 37 out of the last 39 LSATs?
That's correct.
My goodness, man. That is Hall of Fame numbers. So I'm going to run through this so that I will hit on each of these topics individually. But say for one very rare RC and LR pairing and some new stuff that we never try to predict, I think we got everything exactly right. And we only attempt first and second reuses. We're not trying to get the 5th reuse right. We're not trying to get brand new stuff right. Like, there's no way to do that. So 100% as far as that goes. In fact, the test that we said, Dave specifically said, was most likely in the crystal ball and the mini ball was most likely was the April 2023 LSAT. And that is where the vast majority of this week's tested content came from. That was a bullseye. That was as spot on a prediction as we could have made. Dave made it, nailed it. Well done. All the way down to RC topics, as we'll discuss. Let's discuss. So there were 4 different scored sections of reading comprehension. There were 2 experimental reading comprehensions. I painstakingly, and again, I'm sorry for this, am going to go through all 6 of these sections for you. Just listen up. Here are the 4 scored sections of reading comprehension that we saw, and I'll talk about them in terms of predictions, what was reused, what we predicted, what was brand new. Here was the first section that we saw that we had predicted. This was the main scored section that was used throughout the week. 27 questions. This came from the April 2023 test. All 4 of these topics were listed in our crystal ball and in our mini ball. Here were the 4 topics. One was about Jane Goodall and Cortland, I forget his first name, but their primate research studies, chimpanzees. There was a passage in there about criminal lineup of suspects. There was a passage in there about literary biographies, specifically about Dickens and German composer Richard Strauss. And then a passage in there as well about a linguist, Benjamin Whorf, specifically about how like fewer words in your vocabulary limits your worldview. The comparative there was the one about Dickens and Strauss. This was a fair section. I didn't hear too many complaints about this. People had seen this before. Like I said, this came from April 2023. So we knew this section. We predicted it. We told people to study these topics. I didn't hear too much. That was bad here. There was another real scored reading comprehension section. So if you had that first one that I just mentioned, those were real. If you had this one I'm about to mention, these were real as well. This was 27 questions. This came from April 2021. It was repeated in January of 2023. We gave you 2 of these 4 topics. I left 2 of these topics off because, as you'll hear, they were just so generic. They were just boring. They didn't really have anything that you could research. 2 of them did, though. Here were the 4 topics in this section. One was about rational choices with lawyers and juries. That's boring. I didn't mention that one. One, this was interesting, was about foldable Mexican murals and frescoes, big paintings, and Diego Rivera, specifically a Mexican muralist. That one was in there. That was in our predictions. So people looked that up. They recognized it immediately. One, I left it off, boring. Water issues and subsidies, consumption in developing countries. That was the comparative passage. Not a lot you can really do with that. A more interesting passage that was mentioned and that you could have researched was about blue jays, specifically scrub jays, as they're called, and how they pilfer food, hide food in specific experiments that people would do with them. That's kind of neat.
Yeah, let me clarify something you're saying, because you're saying it's boring. I don't think that's actually the reason you leave it off the crystal ball list.
Maybe not
it's
boring.
because it's not notable in its features enough to be able to say, hey, we can direct you towards something where you can learn something useful about the topic.
That's fair. That's a better way to put it. Yeah, for me to say like rational choices with lawyers and juries is a boring topic. That's true. But what I really mean is
that's not true to necessarily to a bunch of prospective lawyers.
All right.
That doesn't sound uninteresting to me. But when I look at that, I think that is such a broad, sprawling topic that
it's generic.
We're not trying to direct people in the crystal ball to just go read. It's not about that. It's about we want you to read something useful that will give you an advantage when you start taking a test. That's a harder thing to do. Whereas learning about Diego Rivera or scrub jays, trying to pilfer food in the experiments, that's something where you can actually get really good nuggets of information.
I think we've actually been unfairly criticized of this in the past in these crystal balls where they're like, oh, they just tell you to go study flaw questions. It's like, no, we are intentional. We're very specific about what we say that you need to know and study and research. So we're not going to just tell you to go study rational choices with lawyers and juries, because how could you? That doesn't really give you much. But I can tell you, go look up who Diego Rivera is and his foldable Mexican murals, because there's something there that you can get your hands around, get your teeth into.
Yeah, and I think that's funny because I remember this happened several years ago when people were really unsure of what we were doing in the crystal ball. I think now more people know about it. a lot more people know about it, clearly.
That criticism has softened over the years because people are like,
Yeah.
oh, actually, okay, these guys actually are.
And also, I think at first we were a little bit hesitant, but somebody was like, well, I can predict a law passage,
Right.
a political science passage, a science passage. And I just sent them a kind note on the side. I said, just so you know, these were the 4 passages that we predicted specifically, and then this is what actually came up. It was those 4.
Right.
And the person wrote me back and said, oh, I had no idea. I was like, yes, it is not just a passage on law. That would be of no value to anybody. It is something very specific inside the law that we would talk about.
Right. Yeah. I think we're always sort of like self-limiting when we feel like, I don't really know water subsidies. What am I going to tell people to all right, we'll leave it out. But scrub jays with this pilfering food experiment, you can probably go find that experiment. That'll give you.
It's also the case that when we look at these topics, sometimes we understand the way the topic is being used within the passage, where we think that would actually be really helpful to know as a head start. Right. And so we'll keep something in, whereas in other cases, we might think to ourselves, no, that's not as notable of a feature. It wouldn't give you a head start. We're not trying to waste anybody's time. Right. Our biggest problem, John, is that we could probably go much, much further than this. And I know our fear is to get so specific that, A, it's a problem. I know LSAC would be like, excuse me, don't do that. But also, we don't want to get people so pigeonholed into looking something up that they start ignoring other things going on in a passage. So it's kind of like a line that we're walking there.
It's delicate. Yeah, there's this Goldilocks zone of too much and too little.
Exactly.
There is also a sweet spot, too, with some of these things that we know about that maybe I won't tell you about water issues and subsidies and consumption in developing countries. But I know enough, or Dave, we know enough about that passage that I can recommend a passage and put it in the recommended problem set for you to go do. That if you actually go do a passage, even if you don't realize why you're doing it, it's this sort of, mind trick.
Osmotic.
Exactly. That it's still going to give you the information you need without you necessarily even having to research it.
Exactly.
That's happening too. People don't realize
piecing together of different tools, kind of like pushing and pulling. It's like shaping glass. You're trying to get the beautiful vase at the very end. It's not all the same action. Different tools that we have.
I like that. All right, so those are the first 2 real reading comp sections. The Jane Goodall section, again, the main one that we saw, the main one that we predicted. The foldable Mexican murals in Diego Rivera, again, another one that we saw a lot of. There were 2 more scored reading comp sections. Let me get through those. One, Dave has alluded to when he was talking through the international tests. If you're an international test taker, some of you probably got this. 27 questions. This one came from June 2021, but we've seen it reused a bunch. April 23, October 24. It had these 4 passages on it. One was about Vera Brittain. She was pro-war originally and then became a pacifist after World War I. There was one about Inuits, Native Americans, the Nunavut, I believe, in Canada, forming their own government and governing territory. Byproducts versus enrichment courts, very hard passage in this section. And then the comparative passage, I think it was last, about keystone predators, starfish, spiders, and how they contribute to biodiversity. So that was another scored section. All of these so far, all 3 of those scored sections of reading comp that we've seen so far were reuses. There was, however, one new section that we had not seen as a reuse. Let me give it to you as well. 27 questions. Again, this is new, something we couldn't have predicted. Here's what it was. We saw this early right out of the gates on Wednesday morning. Uruguay and Argentina, independence post-Spanish occupation. There was a passage in this about scientific experiments and generalization, a really hard passage. Observations versus theory in math and physics. It had something to do with Descartes. Legality of contracts that were created by computers. I think it's had to do with like AI a little bit. And then probably the hardest passage, the comparative passage, had to do with C fibers, physical and subjective experiences of brain states, and the experience of pain. Really tricky. So that was real as well. If you had any of the 4 sections that I just went through, those sections were real. So if you had double RC and any of those ring a bell, those sections counted for you. However, there were some experimental RCs going around. I'm going to very quickly go through the two that I'm aware of anyway, domestic experimental reading comprehension sections that we saw. Both 27 questions, like I said, very quickly. And I'm probably going to butcher this name. Forgive me right away. Here was one that we saw, one experimental reading comprehension section. Ta-Nehisi Coates, African-American writer, critics being stuck in the past. There was one in this about early humans and mammoth hunting, Clovis people, I think, spearheads. It had to do with the comparative passage in this, had to do with exculpatory clauses, contracts and tenants and their rental laws. And then finally, passage I'd love to read, about spiderlings, baby spiders, flying, ballooning, as it's called, because of electromagnetic fields. Sounds cool.
Mm.
An experimental.
Sick.
Yeah, right? That's terrifying. But an experimental section there of reading comp. And there was
that's
one...
Charlotte's Web right there.
Well, very much.
The
yeah.
ballooning spiders is like, they're all floating away. And Wilbur the pig's like, where are they going?
Wilbur.
Yeah, but due to electromagnetic fields, we know that animals, there's a whole bunch of LSAT passages about birds and electromagnetic fields, so it's no surprise that other animals would have the same abilities.
Well, that's what lightning is, right? Like the ground is negatively charged and the clouds are positive. Like that's all lightning is. It's just atoms moving positive to negative. So if you could charge a web, you would think that you could, if you're light enough. But anyway, too much? All right. There was another...
I don't know. I'm just a person trying not to get in between the two polarities.
You just don't want spiders flying at your face?
I don't want spiders or lightning going through me.
Fair enough. If you had to pick spiders...
Lightning.
Oh. There was another reading comp experimental section, also 27 questions. So all the reading comp seems to have been 27. No surprise. This was experimental. So if you recognize these passages and you can match them to something you saw, you can ignore this section. Here were the 4 passages. One was about the cultural influence of India and Indian expansion on the southeastern Asian subcontinent in the 5th century. Thanatosis, which is cool, which is animals faking death. Necrophobia, which is predator response to possums playing dead. Again, a passage I really would love to read. It's a shame. The experimental ones are always the one I want to read the most. The negative impact of urbanization and agriculture on natural floodplains. Flood management. That was the comparative passage. Couldn't care less about that. And then I'm going to butcher this too. Do my best French. Droit de suite, which is establishing artist royalties for resales of artwork. Dave, do you want to give me a better French pronunciation?
Droit de suite.
Damn it. I knew it. I knew you were going
to right. So,
all right.
Think about the rights of them.
Whatever Dave said. But those were experimental passages as well. Rats. So there you go. 4 scored reading comp, 2 experimental reading comp. That's what I saw domestically. That's what I've got. There you go.
Which is cool, man. I had a possum actually right outside our door about 3 weeks ago screaming at us. Explain that. Drove my dog crazy.
Do you want to explain that?
I still cannot explain it. It just showed up. It started screaming at us. Dog went wild. It froze.
Yeah.
And
Thanatosis.
Basically just kind of looked at us, and then we watched it drool for about 20 minutes. And then finally it went away. And then I had to wash all the cushions on the
That's funny.
chairs.
I will say the first person who reported this passage to me reported it as necrophilia, not necrophobia. Not necrophobia.
Good Lord.
And I did a real double take because I was like, that's bold.
That's not a Freudian slip.
So yeah, necrophobia, that's the right way to treat dead people.
And I don't know why you're not interested in natural floodplains when you lived on one in Charleston.
Well, I don't know.
I certainly got to learn a lot about it.
I had a 3-story
Flood
house,
management.
man.
I consider myself almost Dutch now in my expertise at it.
Yeah, you actually do. You basically lived in a boat.
I know how to move water. Let's put it that way.
You had a proper pump out in the front yard most of the time.
You had to. Almost everyone in Charleston has that if you live downtown because it's reclaimed land at the meeting of 2 rivers. Of course, it floods.
Yeah.
With a 200-plus-year-old drainage system that they have not spent enough money on kind of rebuilding.
This is why I rent.
Sure is.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk logical reasoning. So that's all of the reading column. That's 6 sections that we just went through. 2 that were experimental, 4 that were scored, 3 that we had kind of predicted that were reused, 1 that was new. Whew, it's a lot. Let's talk logical reasoning. We're not going to do any experimental here, so this should be a little bit briefer, a little quicker. However, there were 4 that I could count, 4 scored logical reasoning. Let's get through it. Everybody ready? Dave, ready? Here we go. The first real logical reasoning that we saw was another one from the test that we predicted as most likely April 2023. I believe this was 25 questions, but don't focus on question counts. This is important. I can't stress this enough. Focus on topics. Here were the topics. I believe the first question in this section was there not being enough dentists in the region, so they're having to train like new dental techs or something. A question that a lot of people were talking about a satellite or something passing by Venus and Mars, tracking lightning strikes on Venus and Mars. There was one about working out within 3 hours of bedtime and how it lowers your sleep quality. There was one about snakes. I really want to see this question. Snakes don't have vocalizations or facial expressions. So how snakes communicate.
By hissing.
Yes, there you go, like possums.
Or shaking their tails.
There you
which
go.
is worse.
That's how I do it. No good places in downtown to get coffee. Guy who accidentally drove a stolen car that his friend stole and he didn't know his friend stole it. That's also how I do it. Early risers, this is one that I relate to. Early risers versus late risers, and that late risers are more likely to be nonconformists.
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, come on. And then snails, I'm not going to make any comments on this. Snails leaving a trail as they crawl around.
See that every morning.
Oh my God. Your poor wife. So that was a real section. If you saw any of those questions, that was real. We'll get into the scaling of it in just a minute. The snail scale. There was another.
He's living in the country, snails everywhere out here.
Oh, that's what you meant. Okay.
City country. I don't know how to describe
you
this.
meant like the sheets. All right. There was another real LR section. I think this was 26, but I can tell you where it came from. This was from June 2021, but we had also seen this back in April of 2023 as well. So another test that we had predicted. I believe, don't quote me on this being the first question, but it was early. Milk being bad for humans. I think this had to do with pasteurization and milk, humans drinking like cow milk. There was one in there about protecting bats. Fossilized Chinese dinosaur, like remains, and whether or not it indicated the dinosaur was able to glide. Something about the bones. One, Dave, you and I have seen before, and one of the first ones that we had recognized about crazed glass. Remember this? Crazed glass windows and arson fire. Guessing the number of jelly beans in a jar. And then, I mean, what easily is my favorite question in this section about stealing from a children's charity.
That would be your favorite.
Yep. I hope they got away with it. There was
Sure
another. There was another real section. This, again, a reuse. So far, we're not looking at anything new. All of these are things we've seen before, so we know a little bit. And so far, everything that we've seen is predicted. This we didn't predict because this was like a third or fourth reuse. This is from November of 2022. We'd seen it again in September of 2024. Here were some of the topics. Animals living in an area with toxic soil. There was one about rain during a bike race and wet roads, trying to ride upper and lower levels for tenants in a building and who has to pay for the utilities. A question that a lot of people were talking about night as a frontier. Beta carotene and better health. I think that was about like aging people. That was a real section. And then finally, we did see new LR content. This was a new section, and this is the last one, thankfully. Restaurants listing their nutrients or calories on their menu. Studies that didn't know the answer to a spelling test, students that didn't know the answer to a spelling test. Corn syrup versus natural cane sugar. Headaches being treated with painkillers versus placebos. And then another one that I'd love to see was chirping noises being made by cuckoo birds versus pigs or a certain type of boar in the wild. So I know, interesting, right?
Yeah, after that long recitation, I need some painkillers.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, me too. But there you go.
That's a lot of content.
I know. I'm sorry. It gave me no pleasure, if it's any consolation.
That's good. I'm going to summarize it very quickly
Please.
in just a moment. So that's going to make all of our lives better.
Yeah, thanks.
I feel like I couldn't listen to that.
Can I shut up for a minute?
Yeah. I'm going to go through the matrix, and I'm going to overlap a little bit what I said about the international matrix, which is, again, this is an estimation about difficulty. It doesn't come just from students, by the way. A number of these sections we've seen many times before. We've had instructors take this. We've had other reports that come in that are pretty reliable. We have a really rounded view of some of these sections. Very robust. I've seen it, 5-6 times before. Other sections, not as much. It's a little bit more out there. And this is not an exact science. Something we always say. We're trying to predict difficulty. And the thing is if you look at it individually, one person can tell you it's the hardest section ever. The next person can tell you it's the easiest section ever. We're not interested in individual views. We're interested in how LSAC sees it on the kind of like whole level. So the mass of people, how does the average person see it overall? So sometimes people have responses to what we say about the difficulty here that are very different than, what our prediction is. I'm not trying to predict what you think. I'm trying to predict how people as a whole or as an entire group will react. That's the important thing. So keep that in mind. But the idea here is we try to use the relative difficulty of each section around what we know about the scoring scales of the LSAT to figure out how many questions you could miss to get a 170. And in doing so, we started a baseline of 7, although sometimes I've thought to myself, maybe we should start at a baseline of 8.
Yeah.
But we do start at 7. One of the things that we do, though, is we're always conservative. So if we say, hey, that doesn't move the scale, and later on, it was to be found that it did. And usually we're either on the money or off by 1 at most. We've always said that's fine with us. We'd rather be on the conservative side as opposed to the more liberal side of scoring scale prediction. Because if you're on the conservative side, any errors that we make will be to the benefit of the test taker. If you're too liberal and you're just saying, oh, that was really hard and adding a whole bunch of questions, that actually would give people the wrong idea. They'd think they scored higher than they did. So we're conservative with reason here, and it is to benefit the overall. It's kind of like best case, worst case in terms of what we're looking at. But when we start at -7, that means you could miss 7 questions immediately with no accounting for difficulty on your 3 scored sections and get a 170. Now what I'll do is I'll go through each of the RCs. And as you listen to that, see whether or not it moves your scoring scale by nothing, by 1, or who knows, maybe more. And you ultimately get into that kind of situation where you could say, all right, I'm either at 7 or I'm going to go to 8 and so on. And then we'll do the same for the LR where you'll listen for 2 scored sections and then you add it up all together and you can be able to say to yourself, all right, was I, 7, 7.5, 8, 8.5, all that kind of good stuff. All right. So that said, let's start off with RC. Everybody's at -7. The first passage is the one about Goodall, the criminal lineup, the biographies, and the Whorf, kind of like Sapir-Whorf linguistics. We think that is a very fair passage set overall. Every single time we've predicted this, we've said that it does not move the scale. So if you had this as your scored RC, you would stay at 7. That's not the case with the next one, which is about rational choices, the Diego Mexican murals, the water subsidies, the scrub jays. We think that this would actually move the scale by 1 and loosen it. So we would go from -7 to -8 if you had this one. The third one is that Vera Brittain, Canadian Inuits, and Richmond Court's Keystone Predators. It's funny, John, you and I have talked about this before. We have always predicted it as 0, but we often have a conversation over whether or not it's really what we call 0.5.
Yeah.
And
I live on the fence with this section.
Yep. I will say this, especially since it affects international test takers. We have it listed at not moving the scale. And I will remind everybody that this is at a 170 level of scoring. So they expect you to be really good to hit the 170s.
Yeah.
The expectation is that most of the stuff that is like a middling difficulty or above average difficulty, you crush it. You're not supposed to miss too many questions here. You're missing like 3 questions a section to get it, it hit 170 typically. So we've always put it as 0. I certainly think that this is the kind of section where as you go downscale and you go to 165, 160, it does loosen it. So I kind of feel like it's more of a 0.5 thing, which is that's the term that we use to kind of say it doesn't move it at 170, but it would move it at 160 relatively.
Yeah, I'm with you on this.
Yeah. And then that brings us finally to the 4th, the Uruguay and Argentina, the science generalization, most importantly, the C fibers, a passage. And we have this listed as moving it by 1. And I swear, John, I thought to myself, maybe it should be 1.5.
I know, but
yeah,
I think this was the hardest of the 4 that I saw.
Yeah.
And I mean, man, people got brutalized by this.
The chorus of anger over this was early and loud on Wednesday. And so, there's an argument to me that says, hey, if you are down at the 160 level, and I use that relatively speaking, you're not down, you're obviously doing quite well. I could see this moving the scale even a little bit further there. At 170, we'll keep it at 1, but I feel like this is almost one of those rare 1.5 sections that is out there.
Again, I hate to agree with you about anything, but I think you're probably right. This one was rough.
Yeah, which really gives you like a really wide variety. Each one they're all hard. Out of those 4, that Goodall and criminal lineup is relatively the easiest as being middle of the road. But after that, every single one of them has some type of impact typically, especially if you're not scoring at 170. If you're scoring 155 or 160, we think they're really kind of moving the scale more there. So kind of take that for what it is. This is that nuance that I'm talking about. If somebody just says, oh, it's 0.5, no one knows what we're really saying about it. This is where I want people to hear what that is. So that would be Goodall at 0. The rational choices, the Mexican murals, that would move it by 1. The Vera Britain Canadian, we have it at 0, but I think we could make a 0.5 argument. And then finally, the one about the C fiber at 1, loosening it by 1 at 170, but really kind of like 1.5.
Yeah, buddy, I'm with you.
4 different evaluations of RC. I don't know that I ever recall seeing that.
Yeah, we've never done that before.
In years doing this. All right, so everybody is at some number. It's probably different at this point. Let's go to LR, and we'll go through the 4 sections. This is going to be easier to do, thank God. And so then you can just take 2 of these and add them to what you have from RC. We'll start off with the one from April 23 about the Venus lightning, the snake vocalizations, the late riser nonconformist. It's about Jon. And, this is, I thought this was on the harder side. We have it as 0.5, meaning at 170, it's not going to move it, but at 165, 160, it would. If somebody came to me and really argued, no, that's a 1, I doubt I would argue too much about that. I could see that being the issue. Sometimes Jon and I have slightly differing opinions, but again, we take the conservative choice. And here, 0.5 is a conservative choice, so we'll stick with that.
I agree.
The other 3 sections are all going to be zeroed out, meaning they were fairly normal LR sections. And again, I realize that some people are like, no, that was really hard. This was the real LSAT. You thought it was really hard. Someone else didn't think it was really hard. A bunch of people thought it was in the middle. So the protecting the bats, Chinese fossil gliding, dinosaur feather stuff, and the crazed glass, no impact there. That's a 0. The bike race in the rain, the tenant utilities, night is a frontier. Sounds like a book, is also a 0. And then the new section about restaurant calories being listed, corn syrup versus sugar, painkillers and placebos, that is also going to not move the scale, and it would be 0. So you end up with a pretty wide variety of outcomes depending upon what people had, which is not surprising given how many different forms of the test there were here.
Yeah, you got people all the way from 7 to 9, and at half-point increments all the way in between.
Yeah. Pretty interesting. That's a very wide range, and so everybody is a little bit different. That is, I think, probably one of the greatest variety of outcomes that I recall from a test, and it's driven, obviously, by the RC differential going through that.
I haven't seen us this varied before. And it's not us. It's not like we're
not doing anything.
Yeah.
We're just calling it the way we see it. It'd be like saying there's different baseball scores. Yep, that happens some days.
Sometimes it happens, yeah.
There's actually an account on Twitter, it's probably elsewhere, I know it's X, but I'm never going to call it that.
Don't call it.
Called scoregami, where every time an NFL game goes through, they look at the score and they say whether or not that score has ever occurred before. And then say it's scoregami, and it happens like maybe a couple times a season now because so many of them have happened before.
Interesting. So if it's like 2-3 or something, it's like, okay.
3-2, yeah.
But if it's like 13-7.
That's happened so many times that it's not. But the scores are usually, especially down with the 2-point conversion, they're usually like really high scores, like something like 47-29, something like that. Don't quote me because I don't know if that's a scoregami or not. But
wait, are you talking about baseball?
No, football.
Oh, football. You're talking about baseball.
It's got such a limited scoring range.
That's why I said 13-7. I was like,
well, that's football too, man.
Well, yeah.
No, baseball doesn't have as many. It would take a really high number for that to occur.
Right. That's why I was so confused for a second.
I would imagine there's maybe 1 or 2 scoregamis for baseball.
I've been watching the Stanley Cup, and the Canadians just got embarrassed the other night by Florida. Oh.
Yeah, but
you watching this? Do you pay attention to this?
No, I went to a hockey high school, so of course I don't pay any attention to the NHL. Actually, kids in my school who went to the NHL.
You must be a late riser, you nonconformist.
No, dude, I had NHL players that were at my school. I wasn't hanging out with them, but in any event, that's a little sideline. I watched enough hockey in high school because Minnesota hockey is where it's at, and I don't watch it anymore.
Yeah, well, my high school was
back
mostly
to the point.
Finance.
Which is all of these scoring results will be delivered to everybody on Wednesday, June 25th at 9 a.m. Eastern time, and usually a few minutes before then. So I hope that this was useful in terms of finding out all the information, and certainly we hope your test experience was really positive, and you did as well as you possibly could. Any last words here, John?
No, I think we covered it, man. I mean, this is a lot to get through. They threw a lot of content at us, but we did our job. There it is.
And now we are done. So if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave a comment and a rating as well. And if you have any questions, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. And I would especially urge you to do so if you did not hear content that you had, and share that with us. Send it to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com and let us know, hey, I had this. I was an international or a domestic test taker. I took it on a Wednesday, or I took it on a Friday, whatever the day may actually be. Tell us what it was. Give us some information. We will add it to our files. We hope this podcast has been useful. On behalf of John and myself, stay safe out there, and we will talk to you soon.